Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. I appreciate you watching. Thank you for joining me and thank you for watching today. So we're back to it now. Got some stuff due tomorrow for our current module that we're working in, which is talking about these elements that we're going to be talking about today: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. They're sort of our general rules, our basic ideas for design. They're, as per usual, we're talking theory here, right? Like, we're talking more theory and how we can employ these theories as we are, making websites to improve the quality of our website. And we can improve the user experience that our users have on our websites by employing these good techniques. Right? So we're talking about, again, contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, or as an acronym altogether, we can call them C.R.A.P. Right? So we're talking C.R.A.P today. And so when we say, we're talking C.R.A.P, it's, as we've mentioned, it's not what you're thinking, right? But we're talking about the underlying principles that govern the most important aspects of great design. Right. I want to point out something as we're kind of discussing this. When we're talking about great design here. Notice words that aren't being used here. Right. Like, we're not talking about colors. We're not talking about graphics or images or motion or anything overly complex, right? Like, all of these things can work together in a design. But when it comes to the core underlying principles of what can take a good design and make it a great design, it's these four things. Right? It's these four things. And these four things are contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And as we talk about these things today, one of the things that I want to point out is just sort of the deliberate nature of the decision making that is put in for each of these theories. Right? We're talking about deliberate decision making here. So contrast is deliberate, repetition is deliberate, alignment is deliberate, proximity is deliberate. These are not things that occur by happenstance, right? They are things that we have to pay attention to as we are working on a website and creating something. Just design in general, right? So we're going to start out by talking about contrast. And when we're talking about contrast here, what we're really talking about is, a textbook definition of contrast might be the difference in visual properties that make an object distinguishable from other objects and the background. So when we're looking at contrast, really what we're looking at here is being able to make things look different from other things. Right? I want to take my important things and I want to bring them to the front. And I want to take my lesser important things and push them into the background. Right? Like when we talk about art in a traditional sense and we talk about perspective. One of the things that we talk about in terms of like mimicking depth and giving the illusion of, real space is that, as things get further away, they get dimmer, they blur a little bit, right? And things that are closer to us, they're sharper and they're brighter. And, in a painting or in artwork, right, this creates the illusion of depth, and that's one form of contrast that we're really discussing here. And so when we think about it, right, when we think about, examples of contrast that we've seen on websites, one of the big things that we see oftentimes is like a call-out box, right? So, like if we took this slide here, for example, right, one of the things that we see is my title of my slide, it's a little bit bigger than the rest of the text here, right? So it has that contrast in font size. So this item that's a little bit bigger stands out as opposed to the rest of the text on the slide. So if we were to look at the slide here, our eyes are immediately drawn to the title of the slide because it's a little bit bigger, and then they flow to the text. But what if we could change that up a little bit, right? Like, what if we could do something that would draw more attention to another part of the page? Like, what if we were to take this particular bullet point, ups and downs to gain attention, and draw a big, bright, bold square around it? So now we have something there that is attention grabbing. So now if we were just to look at this for the first time, our eyes naturally drawn to what it perceives as the most important thing, what it perceives as it being the item with the most contrast, which is now that second bullet point. Now, if I was designing a website in earnest, like if I was really working on designing a website, I would want to make sure that the things that deserved the most attention got the most attention. The things that I wanted you to see first, you could see first. So I wouldn't necessarily take a subparagraph that didn't contain a whole lot of context and add contrast to it to bring it forward. I would do that if there was something specific about a page that I wanted to make sure that you saw, right? And so if you think about, say, maybe some forms that you filled out before, or websites you've been on where it's trying to give you instructions, and there's one instruction somewhere that's bold and it has a yellow background, and it seems like the creator of that page is doing everything they can to try to make that stand out because it's significant, because it's important, right? And that's what we're doing here, right? When we're working with contrast, we are making things stand out. And so if I were to really want you to read this title first, that's the point where I might take this, put it in a box, because we do have this other element that's over here fighting with it, right? which is also a great example of contrast. We have this image element over here fighting with our title, right? So if I have big text, that gives it contrast from the smaller text, but I still have this image element that's fighting with it. So if I'm able to draw this bright yellow box around it, that's going to help draw the eye to, specifically, my title for it to be first, right? Because the image here is just decoration. Another thing that I might choose to do is I might choose to lower the contrast for the things that aren't as important. Right? So for example, if I were to take this image and maybe put it into Photoshop or Canva or something like that and put like a dark layer on top of it to kind of just dim the colors and dim the brightness of the image, so it would go more into the background. I might even choose to take and blur the image a little bit so it's not as sharp and crisp and clear. So my eye sees it and it's like, oh, well, that's not as important. That is a background element. I need to pay I need to pay closer attention to this element because it's a foreground element, because it has the big bright yellow box and the big large white text. And it's just jumped out and slapping me in the face with its importance. Right? And so these are things that we can control if we make deliberate decisions. Right? And that's why we say it's like a roller coaster. There are ups and downs that are used to gain attention. Right? And if you think about a roller coaster, like sometimes as you're going up, right, that does something to you. That is getting you to prepare your brain in a certain way to experience something. And as you're going down, obviously, that sends your brain through an experience. And so by providing these different levels of contrast, we're able to kind of start to guide our user through a page based on what we deem significant via contrast. Right, so when we're looking at the idea of contrast and achieving contrast, one of the big things is to make deliberate decisions. If things are equally important, make them look equally important. Right, if I have 4 equally important paragraphs, I'm going to make them all the same font size. I'm going to give them all the same background. I'm going to make them all generally look the same. Right, so things that are the same look the same, and things that are more or less important have something different about them. Because things that are different stand out, right? And so the more that something draws our eye, the more that we want to basically denote that element as being significant. Which does bring up a good point that we don't just want to be slightly different. We don't want to just change things just a slight amount. We want things to look deliberate. Right? You know, like I've had people come to me before and it's just like, oh yeah, I used a little bit of contrast here, right? I used Arial for this paragraph and I used Tahoma for this paragraph. And there's not enough difference there. Right? Like you had an idea about changing something to make a little bit of difference, but when something's really close, when something's very similar, but it is a little different, our brains don't make the connection. Right? When it looks similar but slightly off, our brains just kind of see that as a mistake. Right? But if we make conscious decisions for contrast and we have wide gaps in between what we see as important and what we see as lesser importance on our site, then we are making deliberate decisions in terms of establishing contrast. And so good contrast helps us to visually separate content, and even greater than that, it helps us to kind of guide our users through the website. Right? You know, this kind of goes back to some of the stuff that we were talking about with knowledge in the head, knowledge in the world, and the way that patterns and recognizing things that people do come into play when we're building websites, right? Like we have this general understanding as, you know, as we're reading English, as we're reading most languages, unless they're, you know, something like Arabic or Japanese. We read top to bottom, right to left, right? English is top to bottom, top to bottom, left to right. English is top to bottom, left to right. Arabic is top to bottom, right to left. It's backwards. And for example, Japanese kanji is just top to bottom. And then the next line, top to bottom. But that's to say that, you know, when we're reading English, our brains go top to bottom, left to right. And so the nature of things is going to be, well, I'm going to go through a page top to bottom, left to right. But what if I, as the designer, don't necessarily want you to go top to bottom, left to right? What if I have something important that you need to see that's over here to the side? What if I have a little chatbot on the page that I want you to know that it's there? Right? And that actually gives us a little good example of some things that we can look at here on the Cleveland Community College website. Let's pull that over. So let's look at this website here and let's examine some places where we can see some contrast. All right, so just looking at the home page here, we see a lot of blue. Right, we've got our college colors here. We've got our blue. We got our dark blue. We got this nice big hero image, which is drawing our eye right to the call to action. We've got this nice arrow here. And I'll do a little marking up here, right? Like we got this nice little arrow here, which is giving us the affordance, letting us know that there is more down below. But what are some instances of contrast here? What are some instances where we can see things that look different than other things? Right? Well, the apply button is a big one. Right? When you go to, any college, right, or anything like that, the big goal that they want you to do is they want you to come to school there, right? They want you to apply to come to school there. So when we look at the navigation here, we see the majority of the navigation is white text on a blue background. But this one button that's more important than the rest of the buttons, the apply button, is a green link, has a green background with blue text on it. So it immediately stands out. Right, as you're scanning top to bottom, left to right, your eyes hit that green button and they go, green button. Important. Should click. Right, the other big element of contrast that we see here is our chatbot button here. It's in the lower right-hand portion of the page. And we can see that by default, when the page loads above the fold, this is a green button that's on top of a dark blue background. So, just a moment. Sorry about that. So it's a big green button on a dark blue background. It immediately stands out. It kind of catches your eye. Now, there are some problems with this button placement as it is, right? One of them is the fact that it kind of covers up the pause button here, which pauses our hero video, which could be an issue for certain individuals using the website. Ideally, we might like to see this maybe move to this side or something else done with it. Right? It's something that you'd have to kind of research and figure out. But these are examples of contrast that we see here. And so we can see that contrast isn't great for a call to action or next steps, right? And we saw the example of the call to action there on the Cleveland Community College website. Got this big call to action text here. The apply is a call to action. The chat is a call to action, right? So we have a primary call to action, which is inviting the user to see for themselves, and two secondary calls of action, which are the buttons that we want you to interact with. And so hopefully you can see how contrast plays a role. Right? One of the things that I like to talk about when I talk about this sort of stuff is some of the psychological theory behind it, right? Like maybe you didn't know you were going to learn some psychology today, but you are. German psychiatrist and pediatrician, Dr. Hedwig von Restorff, that's her, there in the photo, coined the term the von Restorff effect or the isolation effect way back in 1933. Basically, it just says that when multiple similar objects are present, the one that is different from the rest is most likely to be remembered. Right? So the way that Dr. von Restorff sort of conducted this study is that she presented people with basically a list of items. Right? And so you could think of things like chair, table, stool, and then all of a sudden there would be something that would be completely unrelated to the rest of them, like chair, table, zebra, stool. And so you'd have all these words that were maybe about furniture, but you'd have this one animal that stood out. And basically when something stands out, it catches our attention, right? Like the idea that this happens is fairly common, right? But it actually has its place in science. But we want to be careful when we are, trying to make call-outs and remember back to other ideas of knowledge in the head versus knowledge in the world. Because there is a concept called banner blindness that we want to be aware of. And so banner blindness is a type of selective attention for digital interface. Basically what happens is, as people who are on the internet, who have been on the internet for a long time, we have conditioned ourselves to sort of ignore banner ads. Things that look like advertisements. So if we're going through a website and we see things that look like advertisements, well, we tend to look the other direction. Right? So instead of these things that should kind of stick out and draw our attention to them, they actually divert our attention away because we've sort of trained ourselves to ignore these things. And this comes as a result of cognitive overload, right? Or information overload. Right? It's something that we'll talk, I think I have this in this presentation that we'll talk about a little bit later on. As human beings, we can only have so much information in our brains at one time. That's why taking notes in class is so important, because it helps you sort of get the information as it's in your brain and gives you the option to go back to it later and look back at it. So if I'm presented with a lot of information, if I'm just getting inundated with information everywhere, we get overwhelmed and we tend to sort of shut down. And so we can look at another example here. I have another example of a sample website. It's an old website and it's just I don't even think this was a real website. I think it was just a demo website, or it might have been real. I don't remember. It's been a while. Well, we can see low contrast areas here and high contrast areas. And, well, what is our highest contrast here? Our highest contrast area is the featured product, right? Because that's, at the end of the day, if you have a toy and shoe store, you want to sell stuff. So, of course, you're going to highlight your featured product, the thing that you want to sell the most. And so that's contrast in a nutshell. The rest of these go a little bit quicker. Right, and the next one is about the idea of repetition. So we talked about how we want things that have the same importance to look similar. And that's sort of where we get into this idea of repetition. But when we're talking about repetition in that sort of sense, we don't just mean on one page. We mean on all pages throughout the website. Right? So for example, if we think about the Cleveland Community College website again, throw it up here. Now let's just say, for argument's sake, that I decide to go to the academic calendar. Well, we see repeated elements on this page, right? Our navigation here is repeated. If we go down here to the bottom and we look at our footer, that's repeated. The chat button is repeated, right? It's the same from page to page to page. Think about what it would be like if you went from page to page to page and the navigation was different, or the footer was different. It contained different information, right? Like that's basically changing your experience on every single page of the website. But what we're looking for when we're looking at a website is we're looking at a cohesive experience, right? So we want navigating from page to page, or even navigating within a page, to be recognizable based on repeated elements. So I have the same sort of elements on this page as on other pages. I know how to interact. I know how to do things because it's the same as it was, right? And if we look down, if we kind of scroll down through the page here, we also see some good examples of alignment and proximity here that we will that we can sort of work with. But everything's sort of laid out in these blocks that are consistent throughout the pages. And so we have all these repeated elements that we get used to using. And that makes the user experience just a little bit better, right? So when we're thinking about repetition in that sense, we're repeating styles down the page for a cohesive feel. So by repeating styles, we're creating usability, we're creating trust, which is a big word there, right? Like creating trust. Think about how you would feel, again, if you're going from page to page and everything's different on every page. The navigation's different. The look and feel is different. Right? You kind of lose that trust. Right? There was actually just a big lawsuit, right, with Epic Games over Fortnite about dark patterns, which is pretty interesting. And it kind of gets to the idea of repetition here. Because for a long time, right, they had their interface for buying skins and buying additional items for the game set up to have one button on one side that would buy and one button on the other side that would cancel. Right? And it was like that for a long time. It was repeated in the same way across every single skin every single purchasable item in the game. But then they took advantage of a dark pattern. And we talk about dark patterns a little bit when we get to our ethics module at the end of the semester. But a dark pattern is basically taking advantage of user behavior or web patterns to try to make a user do something they wouldn't normally do. Right? So if I condition a user that on repeatability, on repetition, that the button to cancel is over here in the right-hand corner of the page. Well, then if I switch that and make that the Buy Now button, they're instinctively going to go over there and navigate to that, to cancel, and they're going to buy it. And this got Epic Games sued, right? And they're doing this thing now where you can get refunded for basically every in-game item you bought in like the last 3 years, and you get to keep the item. You know, look into that if you're affected by that. But that does get to the idea of trust there, right? Like if it's the same thing every time, I can trust that my movements and my interactions are going to behave in a particular way. And so the more that you use similar styles and similar elements throughout your site, the better your user feels in understanding and interacting with your design. Right? And so in order to achieve repetition, we want to try to create a consistent feel through repeated design elements. If a certain element contains a certain style, we want to use that elsewhere for items of the same purpose. Right, one of the things that you can kind of think about here is you can think about textbooks. Right, like if you remember back in high school or maybe some of your textbooks here, you know, some of the more, you know, it's more prevalent in like sort of the K through 12 style textbooks than they are in like university style or college style textbooks. But you get like these call outs that are on the page. It's like case study and has a little case study graphic, or try it and has a little try it graphic. And they all look the same throughout the entire book, right? Like every case study graphic and every, you know, the case study outline there looks exactly the same as every other one. And that's so you don't skip it if you want to do it, right? Because if it's different, if it looks different or it's not there at all, right, then you might miss it. So we're creating these visual connections between the style and the content, which in turn makes our website more user-friendly and reinforces meaning to the user, right? And so if we look at an example here, we can look at the old Yeti Cooler site. Right, well, we can see these 3 items here, and they are aligned, right? Which, you know, there's another example here of alignment, which we can look at. But what I want to call out here is the way these graphics in particular are laid out, right? They all have a heading, they all have a blurb, they all have a button that says more info, and they all have a little graphic of the product in the lower right-hand corner. They're all laid out exactly the same, so I can kind of get the understanding that these are all 3 sections that link to product pages. Right? Makes a lot of sense. And so you can think, well, like, what if it looked a little bit different, right? Like, what if the second one here, instead of a more info button, I had a link there? And this last one down here, maybe I flipped the link up to the top and put the title down here at the bottom. Right? It removes that connection between these elements, and it removes that understanding that you get innately. Like if I interact with this Tundra series element, then I'm going to innately understand, since the rest of these all have a similar repeated appearance, I'm going to understand how to deal with this Rode series graphic, and I'm going to understand how to deal with this Yeti's accessories graphic accordingly. Right? Like, it makes sense. Alignment. Things that go together are in a line. Right, so when we're looking at alignment, we're lining up top and bottom, sides, or middle of text or graphics to elements on a page. It gives a rhyme or reason to things being where they are, right? Like when we look at the CCC website again, as our big example. Think about things like this here, this carousel here. When we look at this carousel, we could see examples of affordances and signifiers. We can see feedback. We can see alignment, right? Everything's in a nice bit of alignment here. We can also see repetition here, right? This one particular carousel here is a good example of a lot of the design theory that we've talked about so far. We can see that, great care was put into making sure all of these things were in alignment. But just as important as everything in this carousel is in alignment, it's important to put other things that are not a part of the carousel out of alignment. Put them in different places. Right? Like if we had the student testimonial carousel here, and it was just right in line with, say, campus news stories, then we have two different elements that are kind of clashing with one another. But if it's in a line, it's going to imply a relationship. So the fact that all of these items are related, and so they are aligned, is important. But it's also just as important that these items that are not related are out of alignment. And we can see, other instances of alignment here that represent the relationship of other elements. Right? It's that, it all goes back to that deliberate nature that we kind of discussed there. And it's like I say here, it kind of gives the difference between professional design and, less than professional or unprofessional design. One of the things that can make this easy is if we use a grid system, right? Like if you're in the Web 1 or if you're in the Web 215 class, we looked at, Flexbox and grid when we talked about responsive websites. If you're in the Web 140 class, we're going to talk about next week in our live class, we're going to talk about using the grid system, which is a Flexbox-based grid system in Bootstrap. Using these grid systems, whether it's grid or whether it's Flexbox or whether it's built into a framework, is a good way to get easy alignment, right? Because it's basically going to align things up for you. So quality alignment is critical to great design. So all page elements should be visually connected to something else. And alignment of important content items creates a more attractive design, but it also helps to, generate flow. We typically choose an alignment type. We will choose left align or center align or right align, and we don't mix them. Right? When I say that, I don't mean like, oh yeah, we got to right align everything on the page, right? Because like if you left aligned button text, for example, it wouldn't work very well, wouldn't look very good. You're breaking web patterns with that. But for the majority of your content, you want to pick an alignment and you want to take it that way. And you're going to match your spacing and padding, your margins and your padding when you're aligning these items. because that's part of it, right? If we look at our example here, we see a grid system that was employed with a lot of success. Here for this very old website for a hair restoration clinic. Right, even to the point of where they kind of made a conscious effort to align the image here with their grid system, right? These up and down red lines are the grid lines, and you can see the alignment that we have here, and you can see how, the logo's left aligned, and it lines up with the natural hair growth menu item down there at the bottom. You can see that all of those menu items down there at the bottom are equally spaced based on grid columns. If we look at the navigation, you can see the home button and the third navigation item on the bottom nav line up, as well as the phone number lines up, right? This is somebody that put a lot of time and effort into utilizing a grid to build a website. We can kind of see that, it's not chaotic, right? Like if we don't put that sort of care into it, that's when our websites sort of look chaotic, right? And I think that's really what I meant by sort of an unprofessional design. If things are all over the place, they're chaotic, right? So there is that. And finally here, I want to talk about proximity. And we'll kind of run through proximity here. There are some good examples of proximity that we can have a look at. But basically, when we're talking about proximity, we're talking about the property of being close together. And so things that are close together have a relationship. Right? So if we take things that act and look and feel alike, and we put them close together, then we can say, well, these things have a relationship to one another. These things are similar to one another. Those things are different to these things. And so we can connect like items and separate the site into digestible chunks. And a very common way that we've done that in modern times is the way they've done it on the Cleveland Community College website. Right? They've sort of manufactured some proximity by drawing borders between proximal elements. Right? So if we look here, this element here, all of these items are close together. They're all on the same blue background. Right? So not only are they kind of close together, but they're all within the confines of this same shape on the site. And then we get this visual demarcation here between this blue shape and the next white section. And that's a whole different section with a whole different set of proximal elements that have a relationship to one another. And then we move on from that to this light gray section. And that's a whole different set of elements with a proximal relationship to one another. And then on to another white section and on to another blue section. And each one of these sections contains and puts into proximity like elements. And so when you move on to the next section, you're moving on to a different chunk, right? So we're essentially taking the website and we are putting these things in a proximal order, and that is giving us these little digestible chunks that we can work with throughout our site. And there's actually something here, there's something to this, and this is what I was talking about earlier. The idea of Miller's Law. Professor Miller, there in the upper right, came up with this, also known as information processing theory. And so the average person can only keep 7 chunks, plus or minus 2, in their memory at one time. And so a chunk is any meaningful unit. Right? So we can actually do a better job remembering things if we chunk them together into bigger, into some larger, meaningful chunks that are easy for us to kind of comprehend. And then we get these digestible, meaningful chunks, like we kind of mentioned on the previous slide. And so proximity actually allows us to create bigger chunks because it's easy for us to remember information if like information is all grouped together instead of being disparate, separated out across multiple places, right? Because that takes that chunk and increases it. Versus if it was all spread out, it would be decreased. So in order to achieve proximity, we want to make sure that like elements are grouped and items that are different are separate. And so we can do that through many different means, right? One of the easiest being kind of the way that we saw on the Cleveland Community College website there. The more space between elements, the less connection there is between those two elements. And so if we have clear separation between the chunks of our website that are all different like types of information, it makes navigating the website and getting to the section that you want to get to with your information quicker and easier because you're more easily able to scan, digest the chunks of information quicker and easier, and store more in your brain, which is why proximity is important. And that is where I'm going to stop for the day. So that is our C.R.A.P theory: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. I'll hold for just a moment here just in case anybody has any questions. Seeing none, we'll go ahead and wrap things up here. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.